Hello everyone. So, in the previous lecture we started our discussion onto the water sustainability. We did talk about what sustainability is and what essentially it means, as simple as ensuring the future needs. Okay. So, ensuring that resources are available for future needs as well. So, that is the basic underlying principle of sustainability. We did talk about this. There are various viewpoints for sustainability involving or technological viewpoint, social viewpoint, ecological viewpoint, engineering viewpoint, financial viewpoint. So, we will discuss this eventually. But in today's class or this particular lecture, what we are going to talk about is a Dublin Statement on water sustainability. This is internationally recognized statement. So, to start with, actually there was various issues related to the scarcity and misuse of fresh water, which poses a serious and growing threat onto the sustainable development and protection of the environment, which is very common and realized by everyone. Okay. And our human health, welfare, food security, industrial development, and then ecosystem all depends on water. And because of this unsustainable practices of water uses or the unsustainable development practices, unsustainable practices for overall development of nation or country or cities, all these aspects including human health, food security, industrial growth, ecological systems are all actually at risk. So, this cannot be mitigated until unless we have a sound system ensuring towards the sustainable development. So, for that we need to manage our water and land resources in a more effective manner. So, that is well understood by everybody almost. So, in actually an international conference on water and environment, which was held in Dublin, Ireland on 26th to 31st January back in 1992, there were close to 500 participants involving government designated experts from 100 countries, various representatives from the international and intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. So, all these people attended this conference, which was actually onto the water and environment, and the due focus was basically onto the sustainable development practices. So, the experts there saw that emerging global water resources picture as very critical. So, that is what was realized in that meeting. Then at the closing session, the conference adopted this Dublin Statement, which is nowadays known as the Dublin Statement actually. What exactly is that Dublin Statement? We will talk about that. So, they adopted Dublin Statement in the conference report. The problems highlighted were not speculative in nature, the document they put through. So, it was not just speculative problem that okay, this will happen, that and that could happen, all those kind of speculations. It was not just mere speculations, nor basically they were likely to affect our planet only in the distant future, because if we take and come up with some policy and plan which is going to end show a result down the line 20 years after, 20 years later, it may not actually be serving the purpose, serving the exact purpose. So, problems were there, and it was the question of future survival for the basic human being as well as our ecological systems. So, in the conference outcome, the people or attendees actually thought of that there is a need of immediate and effective action. So, that is what was kind of felt, that there is immediate and effective action needed. Now, what this immediate and effective action could be in the form of? So, the conference participants basically called for fundamental new approaches to the assessment. So, so that we can actually assess the status, the problem, or the if we are going to put some implementation measures, some improvement measures, that also need to be assessed, that how effective it is in sort of remediating the situation or bettering the conditions. So, that kind of assessment is very fundamental for implementation of anything, and that basically was what was thing. And then development and management of freshwater resources was felt essential. The participants also thought that this could only be basically brought through political commitment and involvement from the highest level of government to the smallest community. So, all level of involvement was felt essential, and sort of political commitment, because that is one of the major issues in managing these resources. Okay. Some particular political party has an agenda and they act based on that. Some parties will come, they will basically increase the water tariff, some will come make the water free. So, those sort of political motives should not be there. There should be proper commitment to towards the development and management practices of freshwater resources in a sustainable way. So, it was realized that the commitment will be needed to be backed by the following aspects. So, what were that? There is basically a substantial and immediate investment is needed. That was one of the points which was sort of pointed out. Then there needs to be public awareness campaigns. Public must be aware with whatever is happening, what is the situation of water, because eventually the issues are related to the misuse of water as well from the public front, or not giving due value or due importance to the water, as we have been basically talking in our earlier lecture. Then there is a legislative and institutional changes needed, okay, because without proper legislative and institutional changes, it becomes not it will become impossible to force the people at times to adopt certain measures and certain this thing. Of course, there is a huge scope and huge demand for technology development, how we can put through the better systems or technologically improved system, like for example, for the crop production. Okay. Now, if one particular type of crop is needing let us say huge amount of, like for paddy, there is a huge requirement of water. If you can come up with a technology in terms of let us say new breed, or in terms of new irrigation system, or in terms of new cultivation techniques which sort of cuts down the requirement of water, that will be huge saving of water. So, those sort of this thing was or let us say our utilities, some of the utilities or some of the equipments, water intensive equipments, like we have washing machines, we have refrigerators, we have dishwashers. So, if we can get a dishwasher or washing machine which can provide the effective cleaning in lesser quantity of water, those sort of things can be developed by improving or improvising the technologies. So, that there was a huge demand of technology development in the sector, and there is a capacity building program, means the trained manpower, trained officials, trained managers needs to be sort of the capacity building program should be basically organized in order to release these trained people, trained manpower, so that it can actually be effectively managed. So, that was one of the aspects which is felt by the attendees that this is needed. So, in commending this Dublin Statement to the world leaders, again there is assembly took place in the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. The conference participants urged all governments to study carefully the specific activities and means of implementation of recommendations in the conference report, and to translate those recommendations into urgent action program for water and sustainable development. This was basically done at a United Nations level. So, all the countries were asked to, the most important point is that all the countries were asked to develop the urgent action programs. So, there has been so much of talks like this should be done, that should be done, but that was not happening. So, there it was sort of pressurized that you develop urgent action program that ensures water uses in a sustainable fashion. So, the program onto the water and sustainable development linkages needs to be developed. That is what was sort of felt. Coming on to the particular Dublin Statement, there are 4 guiding principles of that statement. So, the statement that was released had 4 guiding principles for development of like programs onto water and sustainable development. Now, these 4 guiding principles covers 4 different aspects. So, the principle number 1 says that fresh water is a finite and vulnerable resource which is essential to sustain life, development and the environment. Now, there is nothing new. Okay, it is not that if you see, we have been basically talking about this since the start of this course. So, there is no new as such things, but it was highlighted and recognized onto an international platform with over 100 government representatives from different 100 different governments was and that too back in those days. So, it was important from that perspective, and since water sustains life, effective management of water resources is needed in a holistic approach. So, linking of social and economic development with protection of natural ecosystem, effective management, link land and water uses across the whole of the catchment area or groundwater aquifer is needed. So, that means management should be basically on a holistic approach. That is what was pointed out. The second principle was actually onto the says that water development and management should be based on a participatory approach involving users, planner, policy maker at all levels. Okay. So, that is again sort of we have already emphasized or highlighted that why this is important, okay, why the participatory approach like involving all the stakeholders is important, because that will put forward the different sort of need, requirement, funds availability, technologies available. So, all these things will be put into the single platform for developing a policy, developing a implementation program, developing a implementation system for the ultimate benefit of the users. So, that basically the decision are to be taken at the lowest appropriate level with public consultation, involvement of the users in the planning and implementation of water project was felt essential. The third guiding principle, or the principle number 3, suggested that women play a central part in the provision, management and safeguarding of the water. Now, this is again this is sort of a little different in a sense that highlighting a gender specific role into the management of water resources was sort of considered important in that statement. So, the pivotal role that women play as provider and users of water and guardians of the living environment has sort of seldom been reflected in the institutional agreements or arrangements for the development and management of water resources. So, women who are the basic user of at least municipal water supply systems, okay, because they typically in developing countries, as the practice is, the community is more involved in cooking the food, in cleaning activities, in various other water related stuff. So, washing clothes, utensils, household cleaning, then all these things. So, they are the one particularly at household level who basically deals with water at larger part of the time, okay, as compared to the men. So, they play a very central role, they play a very central part in this aspect, and it said that their basically acceptance and implementation of this particular principle involving women as a central part into the provision and management aspect would require positive policies to address women's specific need and to equip and empower women to participate in various level in water resources management programs. So, they must be involved in the decision making, in the implementation, in all these aspects, and they should basically be listened and given due attention in the policy making. So, that was the principle number 3, and the most talked about principle of the Dublin Statement and the most vital principle one can say is that this probably the very early stage when water was considered as a economic good. So, under the principle number 4 in the Dublin Statement, it said that water has an economic value in all its competing uses and should be recognized as an economic good. So, considering water as a economic good which holds a economic value was sort of not very frequent back then till like early till late 80s, that way. So, this was very important, and within this principle it was recognized that the basic right of all human being to have access to clean water and sanitation at affordable price is there. However, means that time if you see that this Dublin meeting was held back in early 90s, and your this right to water and sanitation was accepted in the UN General Meeting in 2010. So, before that they basically said that this basic human right should be this water and sanitation services should be recognized as basic human right, and it should be done on an affordable price, although it is not for free, because the earlier systems did not recognize the economic value of the water, and that has led to the wasteful and environmentally damaging uses of the resources. Because if you are not putting value to certain things, people getting it for free will not value it. So, water can be valued only when people pay something for this, and that was one of the very path breaking concept was provided there, and that way the managing water as an economic good, figuring out this as an important way in achieving efficient and equitable use or towards the better sustainable management was thought of, and it was sort of encouraging it will encourage conservation and protection of water resources. So, if let us say if you pay water, like for example we buy water bottled water at like in the railway stations, trains, markets and various places, we do not throw that water. Okay, we buy, so because we are paying some 15 or 20 rupees for 1 liter of bottle, we make sure that you will not even like to wash hand with that water, because you have paid that high price. For washing hand, if you are traveling in a train, for drinking purpose you may buy a bottle of water, because you do not trust the water which is being supplied in the train, or which is being fed into the into the sink of the train. But for washing hands and all that, you will go there, you will not use your procured water for a cost of some, let us say, 20 rupees per liter for washing hands, because that time you value that water. But the same value, even if basically involved significant amount of finances at beforehand, the same value is not given to the water which is basically supplied in our houses. So, realizing water as an economic good was a very important aspect which was highlighted in this principle number 4 under Dublin Statement, and considering water as an economic good was suggested as one of the major approaches, major ways for managing water in a sustainable fashion. So, or in a more sustainable way rather, or making people realize that yes, water has its own value and we should not use it, we should not waste it, as simple as that. So, these 4 were the basic guiding principle of the Dublin Statement, okay. But the good thing about the Dublin Statement was that it did not end with just some guiding principle or some suggestive opinions. It proposed an action agenda as well, okay, because based on all these 4 guiding principles, the conference participants developed recommendations which enable the countries to tackle their water resources problem on a wide range of fronts. So, they basically sort of developed certain recommendation which was called as the action agenda, okay. So, they developed action agenda, or they developed recommendation that while for the sustainable development or sustainable management of water, how these particular various aspect of sustainability and various aspect of water usage, judicial water usage should be incorporated. So, that was put forth into the action agenda of the Dublin Statement. So, action agenda is basically onto the various aspect. So, if like there were onto the several accounts the recommendations were made, which was termed as an action agenda, and the first of them was onto the alleviation of the poverty and disease. Now, one would think, what is this need to do with the water? We are talking about water, where does poverty and disease come? But it was thought that priority to be given in water resources development and management to the accelerated provision of food, water and sanitation to unserved millions. So, those basically more than a quarter of world population, if you see, was found to be lacking in basic human needs of enough food to eat, a clean water supply, hygienic means of sanitation. So, they said that the basic or the first attention should be given to them, and with the adequate amount of, like with the sustainable development reaching the most needy section will sort out or serve the purpose of not only serve the purpose of providing them the clean water, but would work towards the alleviation of their poverty and to some extent disease, because most of the waterborne disease and all that happens in these areas, the deprived people, because they lack with the proper health facilities or proper management practices. Then there was basically a point put forward onto the protection against natural disasters. So, they said that lack of preparedness often due to the often aggravated because of the lack of the data, means that drought and floods uh, whenever it arises, it takes a huge toll in number of deaths. So, the people are not prepared, they do not have a set mechanism to deal with these situations. Okay. Now, for putting forward a mechanism to deal with these situation, one needs the data. Okay. So, when there is a lack of data, you cannot be sort of design a good mechanism for dealing with these situation in advance. So, once you like, that is one of the issues related to the not having a good mechanism, and that leads to the basically lack of preparedness. And when you are not prepared to deal with natural disasters like flood and drought and these kind of things, so that results in huge toll in death, misery and various economic losses. So, economic losses from natural disasters including flood and drought increased threefold between 1960s and 1980s. That is because of the population increase, because of the development, because of the more investments. So, development is being set back for years in some developing countries because investment have not been made in the basic data collection and disaster preparedness. So, you can prepare a, let us say, nice water management or water supply system, but if it is not having the provisions, adequate provisions to deal with the extremities, the system might fail. So, that is one of the points which was sort of considered. The projected climate change and rising sea level will sort of further intensify the risk for some, and while also threatening the apparent security of existing water resources. So, the damage of loss of life from flood and drought can be drastically reduced by the disaster preparedness action recommended in the Dublin Conference report. So, they sort of in that conference they put through some set of recommendations which should enable the various countries or various states in order to be more prepared towards dealing with the disaster managements and climatic changes, climatic actions. Then there was water conservation and reuse, which is on to the multiple use of water. Okay. That was another point. So, compliance with effective discharge standards based on new water protection objectives, it was felt that that sort of successive downstream customers should reuse water with presently is too contaminated after the first use. So, with adequate treatment or this thing is to be provided, and water should be under multiple use. So, that way, like the wastewater or used water should also will also be converted to a form of resource. Okay. Now, this will provide twofold benefits. One is that you are getting an alternative resource which eventually is leading less stress onto the water resources. So, if you are, let us say, able to meet half or of your demand by the recycled water, you will pump only 50% of the water, usual water, which otherwise you would have pumped from natural resources. So, you are taking less water from the nature. So, that is some sort of water conservation you are doing in terms of quantity, whereas if you are basically recycling your water, not putting the used water or wastewater or unpure water into the natural resources, we are protecting them in terms of the quality as well. So, there was quantitative as well as qualitative perspective. Then there was a point on to the sustainable urban development, where marginal cost of meeting fresh demands are growing rapidly. Future generation supplies must be appropriate, must be based on appropriate water charges and discharge controls. So, that is like when you develop a policy for sustainable development, you, because every stuff has a some sort of water footprints. So, there is a requirement of water, there is a cost associated in forms of water charges or in forms of basically wastewater treatment that is being generated. So, those costs should be incorporated, and residual contamination of land and water can no longer be seen as a reasonable trade off for the jobs and prosperity brought by the industrial growth, which has earlier used to be in practice. Like our industries are sort of saying that although we are utilizing land resources, we are disturbing natural ecology, we might be basically sort of putting some residual contamination also in the nature back into the soil or water, but in result we are bringing jobs and prosperity in the region by the industrial growth. So, the Dublin Action Agenda suggested that this is not a reasonable trade off. One industry cannot say that because I am bringing the prosperity and jobs in the region, I have license to put through residual contamination into the nature. So, those sort of things were pointed out, and it was felt that the development should be in a more sustainable way, and the footprint, water footprint particularly, should be more judiciously estimated and incorporated into the cost, marginal cost of various supplies. There were quite a few more points onto this, which we will discuss in our next lecture, as we will be taking a break here today. So, in the next lecture we will continue discussing rest of the points related to the Dublin Action Agenda and various other aspects onto the sustainable water uses. Thank you.